what were you talking about here? Many of the things you wrote, as Peter says, are difficult, which I would like to get some clarification on.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks podcast. This is episode 231. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much to everyone for tuning in. We are back here for session number 4 of our Square One series. We're rolling through it, man. And before we get into session 4 here of our really important discussions surrounding our faith and developing our faith, let's follow up with a conversation we had last time, which was to read Luke 24, verses 1 to 35. And when you read through that, as a result of that challenge from the last episode, what did you think about that verse, Ryan?
Well, it was, it's one of my favorite passages. These guys hearing the story of the Bible explained by Jesus, and then their hearts are burning within them as they realize he opened the scriptures to them. And I recently preached on the story of the Bible, like the thread that we talked about there. And one of my friends brought up to me, actually Michael, who has been on the podcast, Michael Eldridge, he said, usually you hear other people talking about Jesus as the fulfillment of this, but this was the authorized autobiography of Jesus talking about himself through the story of the Old Testament scriptures. So I thought that was a good way to put that. And boy, to just be a fly sitting on one of those two men's shoulder hearing all of that would be pretty amazing.
I love the idea that Jesus was able to tell his own story like you're talking about there. And I think most specifically, though, in this story, I was yet again struck by the fact that these men got to tell the story of Jesus to Jesus himself, which was so cool. It's like, I love the way that they were able to express that they had faith. They saw him as what they were hoping to be the Messiah, and they heard this evidence and they understood what had happened, but they didn't really connect all the dots the way that they needed to. And, maybe is a little harsh when he referred to them as foolish in his response, but I think it's a really powerful verse that helps us to see that Jesus really is the thread throughout the whole Bible.
What a great way to connect the last discussion with this one, right? In the last discussion, we saw Jesus as that thread and connected the dots. And here Jesus is explaining that, but he's explaining that as a risen man who has conquered death. And that's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so session 4 here of Square One is really addressing this basic question: why should you believe in Jesus? What is it that is so compelling for us to believe in Jesus? And, just all the stories that we read throughout the scriptures about him, what is it that's the most powerful thing to walk away from to shore up your faith or to develop your faith, I think, for the first time?
Yeah, because conversion requires conviction. It doesn't mean we're banishing doubt. You'll never have a question or, struggle to think through it. God doesn't need us to have perfect faith. He talks about if you have faith like a mustard seed, he is mighty to work. The strength is not in our faith ultimately, but in God. But in order to have a relationship with Christ, we do have to put our trust in him, give our loyalty to him. And that's all about faith. And it begins with examining, why should I call him Lord? Why should I follow him? And the main answer that the New Testament gives, that Paul gives in his sermons, that Peter gives in his sermons, that everything we look to says over and over again is, he rose from the dead. And so this session is designed to bridge that need to help people see one solid reason to believe in Jesus. Jesus' resurrection is very well supported if you approach it with the historical method. So I'm excited to get into it from there.
All right, so part 1 of this conversation, we'll kick this thing off with a hook, and we'll get into our icebreaker question. This is Square One.
Why should I believe in Jesus?
Time travel movies tease us with the idea that you could step into a phone booth, doorway, or sports car and experience history for yourself. Play piano with Mozart, battle Genghis Khan, Or listen to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Maybe if we could see these people with our own eyes, they'd become more real to us than reading about them in a history textbook. But until the laws of physics are broken, we're left to witness the past events through the historical method, interpreting artifacts to piece together the story. And as we'll get into, those same rules apply when we study Jesus.
But before we get there, if you could spend the day with one historical figure, who would it be? And what would you do?
Okay, so the icebreaker question there was, if you could spend the day with one historical figure, who would it be? And what would you do?
I was, how about our 2023 bracket winner, the favorite figure of faith, Paul?
Yeah.
Or maybe his buddy and one of my personal favorites, Barnabas. I would go with one of those probably. I think Paul would be really fascinating to talk theology with and to pick apart, what were you talking about here? Many of the things you wrote, as Peter says, are difficult, which I would like to get some clarification on. But what a thrill that would be to tear up some flatbread with, sit down in one of his tents and talk to Paul. And maybe if Barnabas wants to join us for dinner that day too, that'd be great. What about you? Who would you talk to?
I mean, non-biblical characters, I'd have to think someone maybe like, I don't know, Walt Disney, like maybe he could show me around one of his parks or something like that. I was kind of thinking like a biblical character that would be interesting to spend the day with might have been Adam before the fall. There's a lot surrounding that, right? Like if I could get into a time machine and go back, that would be a super interesting way. I mean, aside from the being naked part, but like it'd be a super interesting way of, experiencing the world in the garden at a time when like the world would never be that way again. What would it be like? What did they do? Like hanging around the garden, naming stuff? I don't know. It just seems like it'd be an interesting day.
I see what you did. You made really the character paradise itself.
Yeah, that's
right?
pretty much it.
Go back that is a correct answer for sure. I love it.
All right, so that is our first section here. Let's get into our second part where we really hit the thing a little bit harder, where we get into our purpose. We look at something that Jesus said, and then we get into our big idea and reach out question.
So let's travel back to the first century and develop our faith in Jesus, God's Son. Why should you believe in Jesus, someone you've never seen? How can you trust what the Bible has to say about him? This isn't about taking a leap of faith or acting on blind faith, but as the Bible describes it, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. And arguably, the biggest proof of what we haven't seen is how Jesus came back from the dead just 3 days after his death on the cross.
Someone in Jesus' inner circle had a hard time accepting the reports that he came back from the dead, refusing to believe unless he saw in his hands the mark of the nails. But Thomas's doubts melted away the following week when Jesus invited him to touch his nail-scarred hands. Though Thomas needed evidence, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." It's not wrong to want to see for ourselves, but at some point we have to decide what we believe about the evidence available.
So here's the big idea. We can trust in Jesus because of the historical fact that he rose from the dead. Miraculous events in the Bible are often called signs. They pointed to something, proving that the person doing the miracle was trustworthy and that God authorized what they said or did. Of all Jesus' recorded miracles, none stands out like the day his tombstone rolled away 3 days after his death. That event echoes through time, leaving us a powerful sign that's hard to argue against. And as John said, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name.
So what role do you think evidence should play in our faith?
All right, Brian, so what role do you think evidence should play in our faith? Can we base everything on evidence? How does that work? What is the interplay there?
Yeah, I think for me, I look around and I see a lot of mushiness when it comes to like the facts and truth, because I don't know, like everybody seems to have their own version of truth.
Fake news.
Fake news and all these other things. But like, man, I think for us to be able to have a good answer, a ready answer for the hope that's within us, or to be a good quote unquote faith defender, I think I need to have good reasoning and sound logic. And that's an engineer speaking here. Like I really don't feel like I could make a compelling case to somebody based on feelings and a lot of mushy kinds of logic that people like to use these days. I feel like it's important to have reasons and solid evidence. And so I think the evidence is there. And that's part of what I think is so powerful about the Bible is that it's pointing us to the evidence. It's presenting it all before us. I mean, it could, very clearly just be like, and you should trust us because these things actually happened. And we won't tell you how we know that, but that's just what happened. Like, God could have said, I will give you no information here, but you just better trust me. I need to have that kind of confidence that what I'm doing is the right thing to be doing. And I need to be able to lean on facts and evidence, not over much, but there's a level of trust there. So I guess maybe with everything, it sounds like you could let the pendulum swing too far to one direction or the other, but that balanced view of what's true and what's right comes when we just know that God is who he says he is and trust him, but also look at the evidence that he gives us. Look around you, look at nature, look at all the things that you see in the Bible and all the verification that we can have about this book being his word and authorized by him. It's kind of a big answer, I guess, but I think it should play a huge role in our faith.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about giving our feelings as a reason to someone, as the evidence, I think of that song, all about the resurrection. I serve a risen Savior, and the closing line of the chorus is, "You ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart." And like at one point, I was really struggled with that as that's not a very good reason to give people as a reason for your hope. I have come to believe there is something to that, that absolutely the way that he transforms us, the way he works in us, our faith grows as we are in relationship with him. But thankfully, God didn't just leave it at that. The people of God are a great evidence, and people will look to your life and look to your story and see something often that can help their faith. But there are other reasons to believe he lives, and those have been really powerful in my personal life. And I think it's different for different people. My wife just always believed. She never needed evidence. She just got it. It just clicked for her. And for me, truth is a big and complicated issue for me. And I want to think through what I believe and why I believe it at every turn and be confident, especially when I'm speaking it to others, like you said. But I want to stand on a solid foundation. And I think for me, that struggling through doubt and consideration and pondering has made a firmer foundation. But there are people who deconstruct their faith and never find a way to put it back together. And so you have to be really intentional and thoughtful and careful in how you're doing this kind of work to build towards the Lord. Looking at evidence is really helpful. You examine the evidence and you make a decision to trust. Nothing is going to force you to believe. There is no evidence for anything so powerful that you have to believe it. You just make a decision, whether that, about anything. Yeah. And my favorite metaphor for this is marriage. And it's an imperfect metaphor, like all metaphors. But, whenever I looked at Adrienne, I got to know her for 3 years, and I made the decision, I want to spend my life with her. I want to give my faithfulness to her. I want to put my trust in her, that she's going to give her faithfulness to me, that we are going to partner and work and figure this out together in life. And I did that based on her character and who she was and all kinds of things. Once I made that decision, I'm in. Yeah. Now I'm not examining other covenants. I'm deciding, okay, I need to keep working through things in trust, in faith, and in faithfulness with her. And it's that way with God. We made a decision. We are in a relationship with him. And now we just try to work in faith with him. That's the basis of a relationship.
I think when you say that it's different for different people, I think even Jesus would say the same thing. It reminds me of John chapter 5, around verse 30 and 31, where Jesus is saying, if I only testify of myself, my testimony is not true. If I only tell you the facts of who I am and that's all I have to show and prove, then don't believe me. And then he goes on to give 4 different witnesses, standing on trial, presenting the evidence and the case for Jesus and who he is. At least one of those should be compelling enough for you to be like, oh yeah, I get it. And so you take the leap, you step out. I think for everyone, it's going to be maybe slightly different. So that's maybe a discussion on evidence. We're going to get into a lot more evidence here coming up in part 3, where we get into the book and then we talk a little bit about this reading from 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 11, Paul repeats a summary of the gospel that he received many years earlier, then delivered to others. He calls these facts of first importance and specifically argues later in the chapter that if Christ wasn't raised from death, our faith is useless and pitiful. But he closes the chapter declaring that if Jesus arose from the dead, then we can rise up too, making everything we do lasting and meaningful.
So this isn't just about historical details. What happened the Sunday after Jesus died changes everything for you and me today. Paul carefully explains the facts because Christ's resurrection is the foundation of Christian hope.
So read 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 11 together to understand the heart of the good news. After reading, take some time to discuss it. What are the basic facts listed, and what do you find most compelling? All right, so after reading this passage here in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 11, we're going to talk a little bit about these facts. But before we do that, as we've been doing in these discussions, let's go ahead and read.
1 Corinthians 15, verse 1. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12.
Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whenever then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. So Ryan, there, thinking about this amazing verse, what do you see here are the important facts that are being listed, and which of them do you find most compelling?
Well, he starts out with the fact that Christ died for our sins, and then he adds something there, in accordance with the Scriptures, which brings us back to that last lesson and how all of this was talking about Jesus, and nobody seemed to get it, but it is fulfilled so perfectly in the Messiah who did come. And then it says another thing that we can miss, and that he was buried. Well, I understand why the death of Jesus is important for our sins, and why the resurrection of Jesus is important to, declare him Lord and overcome death. But why was it important that he was buried? Well, there's part of the story there in him going into the earth and, the sign of Jonah and all of this. But a big part of it is the empty tomb as an evidence that this is a fact. He had a honorable burial in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and everybody knew where this. It was a big part of the story and what people understood, and people could point to that tomb They could have pulled out the body, the Romans, the Jews, anybody who opposed them, and said, hey, let's just end this thing. But it wasn't there.
And you don't exactly bury somebody who hasn't died. I mean, that's another like real basic fact here. It's like the fact that he died was evidenced by the fact that they put him in a tomb. Like, of course, if somebody was going to argue the fact that no, he never actually died, well, they wouldn't have buried him then. I think they were pretty well accustomed to making sure people had completely passed this life before they put them in the ground.
Yeah. And then you get, after the resurrection on the third day, according with the scriptures again, then you get to all the appearances, and those are compelling in their own right. But, it starts right at the beginning in those basic facts, all of the evidence that's starting to mount up.
I mean, and appearing to these people, right, is, in my book, is maybe one of the most compelling pieces of the argument moving on here, because he's appearing to Cephas, and then 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So he's admitting here, like, okay, 500 people do not exist on the earth right now who could attest to Jesus being alive. Some people did die, but there's a bunch of people out there you could go talk to right now.
Yep.
And then he appeared to James and to the apostles. James and the apostles may have more of a reason to, I don't know, to make up a story possibly, but like the fact that he's pointing to 500 people, like, just go talk to these 500 people. And then he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So Paul puts himself into the mix here and then begins to kind of talk about himself as, not really being as important as everybody else, but he's preaching, as he says at the end of this, he's preaching so that you can believe. Like, that's the whole point of him even bringing this up in the first place, is this is a reason why it shores up our faith. It develops our faith. So,
yeah, I mean, you're exactly right when you say he's telling people, go and talk to these folks. It makes no sense for him to say, most of whom are still alive, unless that's the point, which is incredible. Like, go and talk to hundreds of people, interview them, check it out for yourself. It's a challenge. Go and find out for yourself. He's not saying take my word for it. He's saying the exact opposite. He has had an experience that changed him, and the life change is the key to this whole thing. That James didn't believe. He was opposing Jesus. He was against this idea, and then he believes.
Yeah.
The apostles are discouraged and broken, and then they believe. I mean, nobody was looking for the Messiah to die on a cross defeated by the Romans. That was not in anybody's playbook. And so it just shut everything down. The confidence that comes from just listing these things, Paul is building to a bigger argument that, hey, you should have faith that you're going to live forever.
Yeah.
If you're going to raise because of this, but he builds it on the most solid foundation there is for our faith, which is these truths about Jesus coming, dying, and raising again. And Paul received it, he said. I passed on to you what I also received. This is a very early collection of facts, maybe even a statement of faith or a summary of the gospel that people were passing on, like a memorized statement that was given to Paul and then Paul passed on. Maybe not. Maybe it's just like, these are the facts. Yeah. This is what I received. This is what you also received. But that goes back to, probably 20 years before Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, that these facts were what he received. So this is an incredibly early statement of fact, which takes away, the legendary ideas and like this story grew or something like that. All these guys, they're getting nothing from this. They're poor.
Yes.
They're humiliated. Everybody hates them. And yet they say, well, what are we going to do? We have to speak in this name. We have to tell people about this.
And I glossed over the fact that Paul was kind of downplaying himself, but I think one of the reasons why he's even talking about his role in all of this was because of the huge change that he made and the fact that now he is with the church being persecuted by the same people who he used to be arm in arm with. It was compelling enough for him to just do a 180-degree turn and now to be suffering for it. And I love the fact that he's bringing himself into this mix because, yeah, why would all of the apostles, why would James, why would Peter, why would all of these people be suffering so much for a lie? Why would they be the ones who open themselves up to this kind of contempt by the Jews? For what purpose? And I think that's why he's highlighting that fact, that he's now in the mix. He's on the other side of it, and he believes strongly that this is the right place to be. I think it's so important that he's included here in this list.
Yeah, it's hard to explain that change otherwise. If you're an atheist, you don't believe Jesus actually rose from the dead, but most of them believed that he rose from the dead and that they ate with him and that they experienced him and that they touched him. And so where does that come from? Hallucinations don't work this way, right? And so people try to come up with their theories. But we're talking about all these facts that we're about to lay out, so maybe we should get into that.
I was just going to say, you're basically just tipping the hand for the entire next section. So let's get into part 4 here, where we go a little bit deeper. We're going to take a closer look at the facts of Jesus' resurrection, and really from a historical perspective, not as much from a biblical perspective. And then we're going to ask the big question here at the end of it.
Ready to go deeper? While Paul laid out a compelling case in 1 Corinthians 15, what if we examined the events of Jesus' death and resurrection from a more objective historical perspective? Many scholars and skeptics, believers and atheists over the centuries have debated these events, attempting to prove or disprove the claim that Jesus conquered death. One survey considered over 1,400 sources written about the resurrection, surveying experts covering a full range of beliefs. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Let's take a closer look at a few of the basic facts on which experts generally agree.
The first is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, one of the harshest forms of execution ever conceived.
Second, Jesus was buried, but soon afterward, the tomb was found empty. Days after his tomb was sealed with a large stone, several women found the stone rolled away and the body missing.
Third, the disciples experienced resurrection appearances. After Jesus' death, all the evidence suggests that the disciples' faith was shaken and all their hope was lost. Yet days later, everything changed. The movement of the now humiliated, slaughtered, supposed king found new life. The explanation of the disciples was that they saw the risen Jesus, touched his wounds, and ate with him. This wasn't a belief that developed later. They proclaimed it right from the beginning, in the same city where Jesus had just died and was buried. Over decades of persecution, they never wavered in their testimony. Far from the kind of men to make up such a story, they became some of the world's most influential moral teachers and willingly died for their belief that they interacted with the man they watched die.
Number 4. The persecutor, Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul, was converted after what he believed was an encounter with the risen Jesus. He traveled the world telling people about how Jesus appeared to him and changed his life. Along the way, he wrote more books of the Bible than anyone else, several of which we've already read from together. His letters open us to a breathtaking new worldview based on Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures.
And last, but certainly not least, Jesus' skeptical brother James was also converted after Jesus' resurrection. Again, the reason given was that he believed he too saw the risen Jesus.
The resurrection addresses our whole being. The overwhelming evidence speaks to our minds, convincing us that God gave a miraculous sign to base our faith upon.
The narrative of Jesus' humiliating crucifixion and triumphant victory over death inspires our hearts with love and confidence in the risen Lord.
And Christ's authority motivates our will as we realize that Jesus has spoken the truth, turning us to him in admiration, love, and humble obedience.
So here's the big question. Do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? The big question we asked at the end of this was, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Ryan, I think I know your answer, but do you believe Jesus rose from the dead?
I do.
Okay.
I believe
Moving on.
that Jesus rose from the dead.
I do too.
I mean, and that is a powerful thing it's not like saying, like, I believe that cornflakes are the greatest cereal. This is
They are not.
like
Just
well, that would be a silly belief.
fact.
First of all, but it is a belief that if you believe this, then there's some things that come with it, a big change. And I remember I was a senior in high school when there was the Oklahoma City bombing,
Oh yeah.
tragedy with Timothy McVeigh,
Sure.
and killed a lot of people. And we watched the news as they interviewed people who were left behind, people whose families had died and stuff like that. And it was really sad. And then there was this gospel preacher from a local Church of Christ there in Oklahoma City that they were interviewing, and he had just lost his wife in the bombing. And the reporter asked him, has this catastrophe affected your faith? What a thing, to like, they're just looking for a story,
Wow.
I guess, looking for but as he tried to process this tragedy and the effect it would have on his family, I'll never forget his response. He said, my faith is based on the historical fact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the TV reporter couldn't change the subject fast enough because he had just mic dropped it. He had just said, here is the reason for the hope within me. And bad things happen. I'm wrestling with this. I'm dealing with it. It's hard. I'm sad. But my faith in Jesus isn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
There's a reason for our hope. And so anyway, that moment has affected me ever since, just seeing that news, because he was giving testimony to me. He was saying,
I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he said that.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So yeah, this is a powerful thing to stand on. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about, if I were to just base everything on this, is there reason, is the most likely, reasonable, probable explanation the supernatural explanation, that when you look at these facts, the most reasonable way to understand them is that Jesus really did raise from the dead, and I believe that they are.
Yeah.
I believe that is the most reasonable explanation.
And that's, again, I think it's important to add the word reasonable into this conversation, because you don't have the weight of history and evidence, all the things we've been talking about here, 1 Corinthians 15, and all the historical record, and even skeptics and atheists agreeing about things that really happened. You don't have all of this weight of evidence there and just get to kind of go willy-nilly and loosey-goosey about it. Like, it is proof. We haven't seen it. I didn't get to, witness it firsthand, but I can look at all of this and put it all together and create a foundation that's unshakable. The argument that a lot of people want to make, and I think maybe the argument that that reporter was trying to get to, was like, there are things that we base our faith on that have nothing to do with reality and reason and logic and facts. It has everything to do with circumstances and feelings and, things that are going on in this life that are working out well for us or not, and to let the winds of change and circumstances affect your faith like that is just like, it's like the waves of the sea tossed to and fro. Like, how am I going to trust God today based on the things that are happening to me? And it's no way to live. And I think, really settling in on these facts, and like that man was able to say, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and that is the basis of my faith.
Yeah. And, I know that we have approached throughout this particular conversation these facts, especially in that section 4 that we just went through, as just looking at the Bible as historical documents that, would be fallible for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
And that's not what we believe, because we have come to faith in Jesus. But we want to encourage people that haven't yet thought through this before they make the commitment. No, there is you don't check your brain at the door when
Yes.
you walk into Christianity. You say, no, this makes sense of life. This makes sense of everything. And there is good reason to believe it. And you'll need that for those hard times and those hard sacrifices and moments of risk and pursuing hard things for God. You'll need that faith. And that faith will only grow once you have the foundation. But all of the disciples said, here is what we're preaching. Something has happened.
Yeah.
And it's different than like teaching Buddhism or something where you just say, hey, we think these ideas are good. No, we're saying something in history happened and it changed everything. This is good news. And it's news because something happened that changes things.
I love that. All right, so let's wrap up this conversation in part 5, where we get into our challenge, we look ahead at the next session, and we offer a closing blessing. So the historical basis for our belief in Jesus is more than worthy of serious consideration. This week, take some time to write down your thoughts on the question, what does it mean if Jesus was raised from the dead? As you start the next conversation, take a moment to talk about what you noticed.
It's far more than an academic exercise to consider Jesus' impact on our lives. He offers the solution to our biggest problems, sin and death, and accomplished it all through his suffering and resurrection. In our next conversation, we'll build on these discussions to ask one of the greatest questions we can ever consider. How does Jesus change things?
And so as we meditate on all of this, may God help us to believe, even though we haven't seen. Okay, so the challenge that we had there was to think about this question. Write down some thoughts surrounding this question. What does it mean if Jesus was raised from the dead? We're not actually asking people to firm up and just completely agree with that fact yet. Some people are going to take time. And I think we all probably took time to really settle in on that. But what if, I think is a really good way of putting this. Like, what if Jesus actually did raise from the dead? What does that mean?
Yeah, the implications are massive, and they'll probably be scratching the surface of it, but the more you dive into it, the more your hope and confidence will grow. So yeah, we could talk about that more next time, but I think it's a great way to end this session.
For sure. All right, so let's take a closer look here about our thoughts on leading this session.
Number 1, perhaps we better take an away team down and have a closer look.
All right, so as we look at parts 1 through 5 of our discussion, I think it's important for us to kind of just really understand that we're not asking people yet to make up their minds. You don't necessarily need them to walk away completely confident in everything yet. You just need to have presented the evidence so that it can kind of settle in and maybe solidify in their hearts, leaving space for that possibility of that question. What if this actually happened, and how would that change things? I think is a good way of viewing this session.
Yeah, and I think it is a very biblical conversation. This is how the gospel was preached, is to build on this thing that has happened, the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, the appearances that people experienced. And so I think that it's really important to let people know this is how the gospel works. Jesus entered the real world. He did something that we needed him to do. And then God put a giant exclamation mark on his lordship, that he is the one we should follow. Okay. And it continues to give us clarity, clues to the truth of his lordship.
And in this whole conversation, we're going to be getting into, and we did get into a lot of really solid, heavy, fact-based historical records. So I think starting part 1 with a little bit of a lighthearted intro here is helpful. And I was letting my nerd flag fly on this one. We're talking about time travel and stuff like that. Might not be your jam. I totally get that. But establishing someone's trust of history, I think, is maybe an important tenet of the next part of this conversation. Like, do you look to historical records? Do you understand that people were actually living on this earth based on things we read about them or archaeological evidence we find about them or whatever it is? Just kind of tying in with somebody that like, hey, we're headed back to the past.
I liked it because time travel was a fun entry point for it, but really you were drawing the distinction between your own sensory experience versus believing that things happened in the past that you haven't seen, you haven't experienced for yourself, and yet you believe that they happened.
Yeah.
And so that contrast is what we're working with, that we don't just believe what we can touch. unlike Thomas. We have to find faith by looking at the evidence in history. So I thought it was a great way to start.
And then part 2, obviously getting into Thomas there in that conversation that Jesus has with him and the way they interacted with each other. I think when you get to the point of talking to somebody in these conversations, I think it is helpful just to acknowledge the place that doubt and questions do play. Obviously, I think Thomas would have been better off if he just believed without having to have the evidence and see for himself. And that's basically what Jesus told him. But I also think it is good for us to have that sort of curiosity, right? To be asking those questions, to be really interested in the answers to those questions. And I think Thomas gets some credit in my book for being somebody who, he's a seeker. He's looking for something, but he's not gullible.
Yeah, I think that part opens up a really important part of the conversation as someone thinks through their conversion also. Because, we're asking the question, why should I believe in Jesus? But underlying that, we're kind of asking the question, how does belief work?
Yeah.
How does faith work? Do I need to feel bad if I am struggling to just give auto consent to everything here? Or is it okay that I'm wrestling with this and saying, this is how everybody in the Bible works through it. This is the nature of faith. And you settle in eventually, but there is a process, and that is healthy. That is okay. And I think that's good to help people work through their own heart on it.
I was just thinking about somebody who reads the entire letter of the contract versus somebody who hits the DocuSign button over and over and over again and just, next question, and proceeds. It's like, I think Thomas was definitely one of those guys who would have sat down and read every single word of that document before he agreed to it. So part 3, then we transitioned into this discussion about 1 Corinthians 15. And I think it earns its position in the center of this conversation. 1 Corinthians 15 is really at the heart of our belief in this great event that took place. And I think it's also worth, mentioning that we are addressing it. We're reading through it together. We're going to answer some questions because this is really the linchpin of everything. But I think it's also going to be really helpful that in part 4, we kind of set it aside and just talk about things from a purely non-biblical, historical perspective, because both of these combined together, I think, is a really powerful and compelling case.
That's well said. And I think that people start to feel like things are circular logic when you use the Bible to prove the Bible.
Yes.
But you have to help them to see, okay, consider this one document that you're looking at, or one collection of documents that we have great attestation for the dating and the validity of the document. Now, whether you believe what is said or not, that is a different process in that historical method where we're working through what should I think about this? And, if you think about why is it so widely dismissed as a historical fact by, a lot of people, they think of it as it's just religion. And the only real reason is that it requires a supernatural explanation.
Sure.
And so if you say you have to have a natural explanation for these facts, then you're really stuck. I mean, there's people come up with all kinds of crazy things trying to work through it if they really take seriously this process of thinking through historical artifacts and historical evidence. But you end up, or at least I ended up with the conclusion that, man, it does not make a lot of sense. I have no problem with the possibility that a supernatural explanation could be valid. And once you get to there, then it's like, okay, this is what happened.
Yeah.
This is what happened, period.
And I think that leans into our part 4 discussion when we, as we talked about there, talking through some other evidences, historically based, and then asking that big question, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? This is the moment where like a do you believe question can be really loaded. And I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that like, this is not the do you believe question, right? This is just really centering in on do you believe that this event happened? And we'll get, obviously, to the do you believe in Jesus as the Son of God? And they're very tightly tied together. Just getting like small, or really this is big buy-in, but just getting that initial buy-in that like you believe that Jesus did come back from the dead based on all of this evidence. Maybe somebody's not going to agree to that right now. Maybe it'll take some time, but like I think this is a good stepping stone to that broader belief that Jesus is the Lord of my life and can change everything about me.
Yeah, and they have to be able to say no.
Yeah,
or I don't know.
Leave space.
It's not these questions. That point in each of these conversations is meant to be a personal check-in, but like a gentle confrontation, right? Something that just forces them to think about the fact that at some point I have to make a decision.
Yeah.
And what do I think right now? And it's okay if you're not sure, but we're going to keep working through. So what do you think about this?
Yep.
And I'm teaching through Ezekiel right now, and there is this instruction that Ezekiel is given that I think is really hard and really powerful, that you have to let those who hear, and let those who will not hear, not hear.
Yeah.
And that word let is really powerful and really hard, because we want control, but our job is to give clarity, to give influence. And that's just a note on giving people space here to make their decision, so that, that will actually help them make the right decision and make it properly, having done the work for themselves.
Oh, and yeah, of course. You want this, as we've been talking about, to be based on evidence, right? Not to be based on like the guy sitting across you giving you the look, right? Or the situation you're in, like just wanting to be out of this conversation, like I'll say anything to end the call or whatever. Like, no, you want this to be founded on real and true things. So I think part 5 here in this encouragement, this challenge for somebody to go and think about this question, I think is helpful. And the blessing that we ended it with was, may God help us to believe, though we haven't seen. And that's really the whole point of this. None of us have seen. We've all been 2,000 plus years removed from Jesus' death and resurrection, but we all have the same evidence. And so, may God bless us to all see that together. And if you're leading these conversations, may God bless the one who you're talking to see the very things that we've been talking about today.
Amen to that. Yeah, Peter goes one step further when he says, though you have not seen him, you love him. And Peter is somebody who saw all of this play out, and he loved him, and he had a different experience of him, but he looked at all these people with amazement and appreciation, saying, you haven't met Jesus, he's amazing, but you have found who he is and fallen in love with him, and you're following him in love, and that is where we live and where we want others to live.
And that, I think, leads really nicely into the next session 5, which is going to be our checkpoint 2, where we kind of talk about this very thing, developing a relationship with Jesus. How does Jesus change things? What really is he going to do in your life based on your trust and your belief in him? So we'll get into that on the next conversation. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in to the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website, BibleGeeks.fm. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice, or at BibleGeeks.fm/131. Go check out Square One on our website. You can find all of these sessions there. You can watch the videos. You can follow along and have these conversations with someone that you know and that you love about their faith. Until next episode, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.